Jason chose to dodge rather than bring his gun up, reasoning that even if he managed to kill the animal with a snapshot, which was unlikely, he'd still have to contend with 600 pounds of dead animal dropping on him. Skittering to the side, he heard a loud thump from behind him, and the sound of an enraged roar that didn't quite manage to drown out the low hiss that immediately preceded it. Glancing back, even as he backpedaled, he saw that Yrrol had apparently forgone her weapon entirely, choosing instead to use her claws. Something he was kind of thankful for, given that the creature had landed between them, and there was a non-zero chance that any shot from the Rikiri could have over-penetrated the animal, and skewered him as well. Unfortunately, that meant he had the same issue as he watched a true battle of titans play out before his eyes. Despite being taken by surprise, Yrrol was the first to strike, closing the distance between her and the gunter with a single step, throwing all of her weight behind a vicious swipe that was aimed at her opponent's face. Blood flew through the air, spattering against the white snow. The gunter barely flinched. One of his long limbs came round, claws like steak knives ready to disembowel the Rikiri, who danced aside at the last possible moment, the whistling claws cutting only the front of her top. Still, from the way his hunting partner's eyes had widened, he could tell that even that was closer than she had expected. Jason moved about, trying to get a better angle on the two brawlers without endangering Yrrol. Alas, the melee was so fast and fierce he couldn't see an opportunity to get a good shot in, or at least one that didn't unduly endanger Yrrol's life. It was a gamble he wasn't willing to take, not least of all because if he missed and wounded her, there'd be nothing stopping the massive gunter from coming over to murder his ass while he tried to reload. The gunter advanced, his claws lashing out with such speed that the wicked talons little more than a blur to his eyes. Yrrol was on the defensive, her entire focus on invading, which was the smart move in Jason's opinion. Wounded and starved as the creature's was, it probably didn't have the stamina to spare. The longer the fight went on, the more likely the thing would stumble, or Jason would get an opportunity to get a shot off. Of course, the animal had to show a level of intelligence at odds with its bestial form. It fainted. Yrrol yelled in surprise and pain as another blow came in from an unexpected angle. Her last-second dodge only sufficient to keep her from being disemboweled as the long claws raked across her stomach. Once more, vivid red blood spattered across the pristine white snow of the clearing, only this time it was from the Rikiri. Jason got ready to take a shot, figuring that a small chance of hitting Yrrol was better than the reasonably decent chance of her getting savaged in the next few seconds. Only the creature didn't move to finish off Yrrol. Instead, it turned and charged towards him in one fluid motion. Evidently, it had decided he was the easier meal. Its battle with Yrrol a mere attempt to get her out of the way, so it could pursue its real target. Something Yrrol realized too, as she clenched at her bleeding gut, vaguely Russian accent coming out in full force as she uttered him to run! Jason would have rolled his eyes if they weren't currently focused on the task of sighting down the massive werebear from hell, bearing down on him. Fortunately, he'd made sure to keep a good distance between them, even as he tried to get a shot in on the melee. There was a good 5 meters between him and the creature when it had started running towards him, which gave him all the time he needed to line up his shot on the target moving in a straight line. Just like a ball, really, he thought, as he gently squeezed the trigger. There was no bang. Just like when he'd fired off a few practice shots earlier, there was barely even a hum as the coil gun unleashed his payload. The only proof that he'd fired at all was the way the gunter jerked slightly. It took another step before it stumbled, a look of almost comical confusion on his face as his legs seemed to give out beneath it. Finally, it slumped down into the snow, right at Jason's feet. Dead before it hit the ground, Jason reasoned as he stared at the steaming corpse. Though he was outward calm, his heart was pounding almost painfully in his chest. It was one thing to blast a ball that was charging straight at you, quite another to kill one of these. Still, different species notwithstanding, the actions had been the same. His quadruple gains meant that his shot had taken it in the upper chest, lightly filleted from lungs to anus. Textbook. "You okay, Yrrol?" he asked, stepping around the corpse and moving towards the downed Rikiri. Well, he thought she'd been downed. Apparently she'd gotten back up in the intervening moments between her last cry and him shooting. That seemed to be all she'd done, though. The alien looked almost frozen in place, one hand still outstretched. She said lamely, holding the other against her gut. Jason looked at the wound, which was bleeding less than he'd have expected. "Do we need to get you to a hospital?" That seemed to snap the alien out of her fugue, as she finally lowered her arm. No, I should be fine." He couldn't help but notice that her vaguely Russian accent was back again, still cultured but with none of the pitch-perfect enunciation of her Shilvanti. You sure? He asked. It looked pretty nasty. Rakiri are quite hardy, she said as she shook her head, moving her hand away. It has already stopped bleeding, see? He couldn't, what with all the blood-matted fur in the way. Her pristine white fur was coated in it. Still, he figured it was best to take her word for it. Well, we got him, Jason said, gesturing to the corpse. Her, Yrrol corrected, almost absent-mindedly, as she stepped over to the corpse to examine it. And I suppose we did, though I'd say the bulk of the credit goes to you. Hardly, Jason scoffed. If you hadn't kept it distracted when it first dropped, it'd have filleted me there and there. A joint effort, then. The woman sounded distracted as she spoke. Jason moved over to see what she was looking at. Is that a laser burn? He asked, seeing the all-too-familiar patch of discoloured flesh and missing hair. Infection had clearly set in on the wound, but the underlying cause was still easily recognisable to him. They had certainly been a common enough sight in the opening years of the invasion, and not something he was liable to soon forget. It looked like the gunter had been skimmed by the beam, leaving a long streak of burnt tissue along its side. Jason glanced down at the weapon in his hands. I thought you said your people use coil guns. When hunting, Rakiri allowed, standing back up again. When it comes to matters of self-defense against other sapiens, however, we are far more practical. Some homesteaders have Shorvanti firearms in case of a pirate attack. She glanced at the weapon in his hands. Shorvanti arms are also cheaper than those made on dirt. Jason turned his attention away from the downed animal. I'm sorry, did you just say dirt? Yes. That's the name of your homeworld, he chuckled. Yes? The woman paused, cocking her head at him. Is that strange? Jason actually paused, his laughter dying in his throat. Did he really have room to talk? Earth was called Earth, after all. Dirt by any other name was still dirt. No, he concluded reluctantly. I suppose it's not. The Rakiri's head was still cocked as she stared at him, but eventually she turned back towards the downed gunter. Slowly she reached down and, with a smooth motion, pulled out one of the beast's long canines. Here. Jason stared at the pre-offered fang. He wasn't usually one for trophies. He was scared the hunter for the experience, not really to catch anything. Not that he begrudged a man a nice set of antlers on the wall. Still, he supposed as he reached out to take the offering, a tooth wasn't a bad memento. The thing was as long as one of his fingers, and surprisingly heavy in his hand. Rakiri placed great value on hunting trophies, Yrrol said, sounding pleased. The woman reached under her slightly shredded top and pulled out a necklace. Jason hadn't even realized she was wearing one. Her white fur covered up the string. That's a long-ass tooth, Jason said, staring at the fang that was easily twice the size of the one in his hands. The Rakiri practically preened under the compliment. It was taken from a shellcat, an ocean-dwelling predator of the homeworld. It was the product of many summers' work on my uncle's fishing boat as a teenager, in order for me to afford a place in the hunting expedition. She glanced down at her trophy. It was worth it, though. It brought me much awe and envy for my peers. Her attention turned back to Jason's own. As should your own bring you. Bringing down a gunter is no small feat. Jason smiled up at the Rakiri before pocketing the tooth. I think we can save the adoration for another day. Right now I settle for a shower and a mug of something hot. Now that the adrenaline from the hunter worn off, his body was reminding him of how cold was biting into it, and how sore his limbs were. Trekking through the snow might have made for some picturesque scenery, but it was murder on the joints. I would concur, Yrrol said, before looking sheepish. However, I would beg some more patience of you, Jason, given my current state. She gestured to the blood that amply covered her. I fear that setting off now would forevermore stain my vehicle. Jason nodded. No one enjoyed getting blood out of their car seats. The Rakiri paused. There is, however, a spring nearby. I have gone there often, and I can assure you that the warm currents had a suitably rejuvenating effect. Jason stared at the Rakiri, who seemed totally matter-of-fact. A small suspicion bloomed in his mind, but he quickly snuffed it out. He was just being paranoid. Lead the way. One would think, given Yrrol's fur, her stripping out of her shorts and top would be a boring experience. One would be wrong. Are you okay, Jason? Jason deliberately tore his eyes away from the alien's silhouette curves, the way her delicate pink nipples poked through the downy soft white fur that covered her chest. "Fine," he not quite squeaked. One of Yarrow's ears twitched slightly, but other than the tiniest smirk at the corner of her lips, made no other acknowledgement of his blunder, as she stepped out of her discarded shorts and stepped gracefully into the steaming pool of water she'd led him to. Jason deliberately didn't look, though, instead turning his gaze to the sagamite-covered ceiling above. The pool was just inside a cave entrance and thus was sheltered from the wind. Between that and the steam that billowed from the water, the interior was positively humid. "Are you not going to change?" a voice asked from below. Recognizing that he was putting it off for reasons he was trying not to read into, Jason set about unzipping his jumpsuit. As he did, he couldn't help but notice that Yarrow hadn't turned away. The Rikiri was watching from the pool, and while her gaze wasn't particularly lecherous, there was no mistaking that there was a certain intensity to her gaze. Nude as the day he was born, he ignored her and stepped towards the water. Part of him was tempted to test the water first with his toes, but his pride as a man wouldn't allow it. Seeing a little recourse but to step straight in, lest his courage be called into question, he stepped into the water. Fortunately for him, the water was pleasantly warm. Not hot, just warm enough to be pleasant. "Nice, no?" Yarrow prompted. He looked up to agree, only to have his words catching his throat. The Rikiri's fur was slick with water, perfectly adhering to her form and showing off every inch of her chiseled physique. From her toned stomach to her perfect teardrop-shaped breasts, the alien woman looked positively sensuous as the seam curled tantalizingly around her generous curves. "Amazing," he murmured before coughing. I mean, yeah, it feels great." Yarrow's smile only grew, but she said nothing, moving over to sit beside him. The move surprised him, but he didn't complain, as he found himself sitting shoulder to shoulder with the woman, her sodden fur tickling against his skin. "It is nice to finally be able to show someone this place," she murmured, leaning back, which did all sorts of interesting things to her breasts, as water trickled across them to drip into the pool. "Shelvanti have little interest in hunting. I feel they believe it beneath them. Even tried to curb it when they first conquered our world." Jason was curious about that. He knew of similar things going on with Earth. While the Shelvanti seemed pretty content to let most things go on as before, they had a habit of constantly poking in and changing things, on a local and national level. He remembered a newscaster likening it to trying to change an engine while the car was still running. In essence, they were trying to take control by usurping the existing structures of power, rather than letting them fall into a vacuum. It was easier to control a stable society than a fractured one, after all. "They succeed?" he asked. The woman scoffed, still leaned back, a strange sound coming from the normally sophisticated alien. "They gave up when they saw how much resistance they were getting. In the end, it wasn't worth the trouble for them, which they were wise to do. Hunting is as integral to Rikiri society as..." She paused. "I do not actually know what the comparison for a human would be." She turned a speculative eye on him, and Jason was half tempted to say promiscuity. He was pretty sure that was the answer a Shelvanti would give, if asked about humans. "We don't really have one thing," he admitted. "Humans seem to have more differences than commonalities. Different societies have different values. Hell, the only thing humans all seem to have in common is that we're belligerent as hell." Rather than laugh like he expected, Yarrow just nodded as if he'd made a pithy observation. "Yes, from what news we have received out here on the fringes of the Imperium, your race does seem to have a great affinity towards rebelliousness." She smiled at him. "I will imagine there are a number of Shelvanti analysts right now who are tearing their hair out, as you all keep throwing off their projections." Jason didn't know what to say to that. To be honest, he hadn't been keeping up with news on Earth. Not least of all because doing so would only serve to make him homesick, but also because he hadn't really had the time between basic training and getting deployed. It wasn't like it mattered. He couldn't do anything about what was happening on Earth, and given his current employment, he'd be seen by many who lived there as a traitor. Which he was, even if he hadn't had much say in it. "Today's been nice," he said, trying to change the topic of the conversation. "It has," Yarrow said. "While I did not intend for it, the addition of the gun trailer was welcome. It added spice to the encounter." Jason noticed that while she was talking, she moved closer, even closer. Her sodden fur pressed against his arm, and her hand was now resting on his thigh. The same look was in her eyes as she gazed down at him. I must admit, I did not put much stock in suggestions of human openness. When I suggested we come to this pool, I will confess that I was mostly joking. I was surprised when you accepted. Jason felt some stirrings down below as the alien looked down at him, but he moved to push her hand away. Sorry, I can't, he said regretfully. To her credit, Yrrol took the rejection with aplomb as she backed off. Jason tried not to wince at the loss of contact. An interesting choice of words. Can't. Jason shook his head. I have a girlfriend. A human? On Earth? Yrrol nodded. That must be difficult. Jason chuckled. A Shilvanti, actually. Yrrol perked up, her eyes turning towards him like little radar dishes. Yet you are monogamous? Not exactly. Jason frowned a little. Just dealing with some human hang-ups. He knew Raja had no issue with him seeing other women. She'd said as much. So long as her place in the unit was assured until they met again, she was happy. To be honest, it seemed unfair to him, but she laughed and just said that was how Shilvanti did things. She had also pointed out that it wasn't like she'd be meeting any guys while at the Aviary. So the issue here is honor, not one of attraction? Yrrol asked. It definitely was one of attraction. Sure, Yrrol was a hell of a lot more alien than the Shilvanti, but Jason could admit that he was enough of a xenophile that was no issue for him. Quite the opposite. Nothing quite so noble, he assured. And yes, you are very attractive, Yrrol. If the alien could flush, he was pretty sure she would. Instead, he couldn't help but notice the way her tail whipped languidly through the water behind her. If you are trying to dissuade me from continuing my courting, Jason, then you are doing a poor job of it, the Rikiri murmured, a hint of huskiness in her voice. Jason just laughed, causing the alien to smile back. Though I have no intention to pressure you, the alien said, her tone becoming serious. I have made my desires known. I believe you'll feel the same. Jason glanced at the ceiling. Did he want this? Yes, he certainly did. It just didn't feel right that the thing he wanted was also the correct answer in this situation. Wasn't the noble option supposed to be the difficult one? Instead, he felt like he was just rationalizing it all away. The problem was, it was the rational answer. Rush had consented. He was interested. Yrrol was interested. Nothing else needed to be said. Finally, he came to a decision. Fuck it.